Hi guys, meeting you after a long time. This is Professor M.K. Sharma from the Department of Business Administration. We are going to talk about hypothesis formulation. This is the first part of the two-part video that I'm producing for the students of the Department of Business Administration of Tezpur University. In fact, this is a very basic discussion targeted to the management students, and any student from any management school can get benefit from this basic understanding. For any kind of business research, you must understand the hypothesis formulation in order to understand the basics of inferential statistics. Generally, what happens is that we convert a belief into a statistical expression. And when we do that, this is known as hypothesis. Why do you try to convert a belief into a statistical expression? Because we will check if our intuition is correct. Our belief is also known as intuition, which doesn't have much scientific basis, and therefore it is only a belief. And that belief we want to convert into a hypothesis by giving them a color of statistical expression. Ideally, we formulate the hypothesis before starting the data collection. That is, we have a belief and we have our entire research towards understanding that belief, towards trying to prove that our belief is right. So, therefore, we formulate a hypothesis. It may not be only the hypothesis, it may be different hypothesis. We formulate that hypothesis before starting the data collection. The basic idea here is that if we know about the hypothesis, or if we are clear about the hypothesis, then we know what kind of variables we want to measure and what should be the scale of measurement of that particular variable. There may be one variable or two variables, or we might have univariate, bivariate or multivariate analysis. But if we have that hypothesis beforehand, then we know exactly what we are doing, and then ultimately that is our objective for collection of the data. We collect the data through a survey. We collect the data from experimentation, or we may collect the data through observation. There are so many different ways of collecting data, but we must have an objective, and that objective is to be achieved. But sometimes what happens when our research is very big and already we have collected so many data, normally when we do a survey, what happens is that during the survey we keep on collecting data which are ultimately helping us in achieving the objective of the research. But when we talked about the objective of research, we say that this research at the end of the day should be able to achieve this. So we have a lot of data, and then in the course of analysis we realize that there might be a relationship between these two different variables, or there might be some particular variable that should have taken this particular value. And let us see whether it has taken that value or not. So another very important concept here is that when we collect data through a sample, or we try to analyze the data, this is known as descriptive statistics, such as the mean of the sample, standard deviation of the sample, or correlation of the sample, or among different variables within the sample. Now, these descriptive statistics do not necessarily say something about the population from where we have collected the samples. The population is very big, and we have selected a very small sample. Until and unless our population is entirely homogeneous, that small sample cannot really represent all the elements of the population. For example, a pot of rice where we take 2 or 3 grains of rice to see whether the pot of rice is boiled or not. We have to taste it. We press it and see whether it is overboiled, perfectly boiled, or yet to be boiled. And then we take a decision for the entire pot of rice from 3 different grains that represent all the grains without any difficulty. Normally, what happens in social science and business research is human beings are not like grains and rice. Each one of us has a different attitude. Each one of us will think differently. Each one of us will be behaving differently, or each one of us will be taking different values for different stimuli. So what happens for descriptive statistics that it may not be able to tell us about the population. So what we do, we go for inferential statistics. We infer about the population. And from where do we infer? From the characteristics of the sample. So when we try to infer about the population, we will have to do a hypothesis. Or we'll have to formulate a hypothesis first and then do the hypothesis testing. First, we'll have to formulate the hypothesis, then we have to test that hypothesis. By now, what we have learned is that ideally, we formulate the hypothesis before starting the data collection. But sometimes when our data are rich and a lot of data are collected, and then we find out while in the course of our analysis, we try to explore no new relationship. And then probably we formulate the hypothesis even after the collection of the data. And that hypothesis will be suitable for the data. In earlier case, the data will be suitable for the hypothesis. Later case, our hypothesis will be suitable for the data in our hand. There are 2 types of hypothesis. Null hypothesis, which is written as capital H and 0. 0 is subscript, so we call it H naught. And alternative hypothesis, H1. The condition that the null hypothesis is giving should not be repeated in the alternative hypothesis. And whenever we write the alternative hypothesis, must not be written in null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis neutralizes the belief that we already have. And in the alternative hypothesis, what happens is the belief is generally reflected in the alternative hypothesis. What happens here is that the null hypothesis neutralizes the belief, which means it tells you a different story than the belief where alternative hypothesis will be actually the belief. So what is the null hypothesis? It neutralizes the belief. And what is the alternative hypothesis? It is basically the belief. While trying to formulate a hypothesis, there are 2 basic formats of hypothesis formulation. And if you know about these 2 basic formats, probably you can go for different kinds of analysis without much difficulties or errors. Format 1. In this format, the null hypothesis is written as that there is no relationship between the 2 variables. Suppose we are trying to measure the relationship between variable x and variable y. So we write that there is no relationship between these 2 variables. We can also write the same null hypothesis, meaning the same thing, that variable x and variable y are independent. In any of the ways, you are writing the hypothesis correctly and you are saying the same thing. And when you write this null hypothesis, we have to write an alternative hypothesis. In that alternative hypothesis, we write that there is a relationship between the 2 variables. Earlier, what we wrote, the null hypothesis, that there is no relationship between the 2 variables. Now, in alternative hypothesis, we say that there is a relationship between the 2 variables. So, what we do, we hypothesize. Now, there is a little technical catch. if you are writing that there is no relationship between two variables as the null hypothesis, you write the alternative hypothesis as that there is a relationship between the two variables. And if you write that a variable x and variable y are independent as the null hypothesis, you write variable x and variable y are dependent on each other as the alternative hypothesis. So that is the small technical thing that you should remember. You cannot, mix up alternative hypothesis in one way and null hypothesis in another way. So let us take an example. Example 1. Our belief is that males consume less perfume than the females. Here, you must understand that we are dealing with two variables. Can you spot the two variables? I think you can. But still, let me tell you. The first variable is the gender. Gender is measured with two options, males and females. And because it is males and females, and it doesn't take any value, any numerical value other than the males and females, this is known as a nominal scale. Also, there is another variable. That variable is consumption of perfume. Let me tell you that you may measure consumption of perfume in various different ways. For example, you may say that a person consumes how many cans of perfume, how many bottles of perfume, how many milliliters of perfume he or she consumes. Or you can say that how much money he or she spends in buying the perfume in a particular period of time. Or simply you can say that a person consumes low amount of perfume, a person consumes medium amount of perfume, and another person consumes a high amount of perfume. So when you are dealing with low, high and medium, or rather high, medium and low, so this becomes a nominal scale. So consumption of perfume, for this particular example, we measure it as a nominal scale. So when we are dealing with two nominal scales in our belief, we write our null hypothesis like this, that gender, males and females, are representing the gender, and consumption of perfume, high, medium and low consumption of perfume, that gender and consumption of perfume are not related. You can write the same hypothesis as gender and consumption of perfume are non-dependent. That is, gender and consumption of perfume are independent of each other. And when you write that null hypothesis, the gender and consumption of perfume are independent, then you write your alternative hypothesis as a gender and consumption of perfume are dependent on each other. And if you write simply the gender and consumption of perfume are not related, then what do? You write the alternative hypothesis as gender and consumption of perfume are related. Now if we reject this null hypothesis, in fact you must also always understand that our job is to reject the null hypothesis in order to test our belief. Our belief is that males consume less perfume than the females. If you reject, or if you are able to reject this null hypothesis from the data that we have collected from the sample, we can with some degree of confidence say that the males consume less perfume than the females, or females consume less perfume than the males, depending on the data that we generate from our sample. We'll talk about these in another video. So let us take another example. I'll leave you with this belief, and I want you to formulate the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis yourself. And when you come back with the second part of this video, hypothesis formulation, we'll start with the right answer of this particular belief, how we are supposed to write the null hypothesis for this belief. The males prefer cola flavor more than the females. I repeat once again, males prefer cola flavor more than the females. So guys, what we have learned today, that we can write the hypothesis, or we should write the hypothesis, or normally we write the hypothesis to test our belief. That is, hypothesis is a statistical expression of our belief or intuition. Why do you have to test the hypothesis? Because we want to infer about the population from the characteristics of the sample. Because samples are supposed to represent the population. And if this, we will check with by testing the hypothesis, or one hypothesis, that whether our sample is really actually helping us in inferring about the population. Then we have learned that either we formulate the hypothesis before we start the collection of the data, so that the variables, so that the scales of measurement can be synchronized with the hypothesis, or sometimes what we do, we may write the hypothesis after collection of the data. Normally, which is not done, but when we have got a rich data, we have got a lot of data in our hand, and we try to find out new relationships, explore newer relationships, probably then we can formulate, or it is allowed to formulate data after allowed to formulate the hypothesis after collection of the data. We have also learned that there are two types of hypothesis. One is null hypothesis, the other one is the alternative hypothesis. Null hypothesis basically neutralizes the belief, and alternative hypothesis basically is expression of the belief. So we have taken one example, and I am leaving with this example 2 to think about, and we wait till the next video. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have got any question, you can send me a message in the WhatsApp. You can always ask that question in the Google Classroom, or you can send a mail, or you can call me without any problem at any point of time. Thank you very much. Take care, and God bless you.